Hello friends, I am glad to see you again. Today I'm going to tell you about an HOA that thinks they can manage my pond. I remember the day I returned from a short trip to the city, feeling pretty good about a recent deal I'd made on some high-quality feed, only to find something that made my stomach churn. There, right at the edge of my property, a garish wooden sign had been hammered into the ground. It declared in large block letters that the land behind it, my land, was public property now available for recreational use by the community. In smaller letters beneath that, it stated that all neighbors were welcome to enjoy the pond at their leisure. I stood there, utterly dumbfounded, wondering who on earth had taken the audacity to do this. This was no prank from local teenagers. No, it was the handiwork of the local homeowners association, an organization that I had refused to join when I first bought my place several years ago. When I'd purchased this property, I made sure to do my research. My land was older and predated most of the tract houses around me by decades. It wasn't part of their association, yet here I was, looking at a sign boldly declaring that my privately owned acreage was now some kind of communal parkland. I recognized the logo in the corner of the sign, the same logo that appeared on those monthly newsletters from the HOA. I'd only skimmed their newsletters before tossing them, always ignoring their nudges to consider joining our exclusive community group. I wanted no part of their endless dues, nitpicky rules, and bureaucratic nonsense, but apparently my refusal had rubbed some of them the wrong way. Over the past 6 months, the HOA board, led by a particularly arrogant man named Curtis, had tried everything to get me under their thumb. He'd shown up to my door, all smiles and handshakes, insisting that since I lived nearby, I was functionally part of the neighborhood, and that meant I had an obligation to contribute. I'd politely refused. Then came the letters that got more and more pointed, suggestions that I was freeloading on shared infrastructure, that I wasn't participating in community events, and that maybe my property's boundaries should be clarified. I'd ignored them. I figured my rights were clear and my title was rock solid. The small orchard, the vegetable garden, the pond. They were all mine. This wasn't some suburban development's green space. It was a farm property I had saved years to buy. The local authorities recognized it as such. I believed it ended there. Now I could see just how wrong I'd been. Somehow the HOA had decided to take unilateral action. They literally put a sign on my land, declaring it was open to everyone. It wasn't just insulting, it was a violation of my property rights. For a few minutes, I just stood there trying to wrap my head around their gall. All I could think was, how do they imagine they'll get away with this? To my mounting frustration, I saw the first visitors arrive not long after. 2 families I vaguely recognized from down the road strolled right past my no trespassing signs as if they'd vanished into thin air, headed straight for my pond with towels and picnic baskets. I confronted them gently at first. I walked down and said, "Excuse me, this is private property. What are you doing?" One of the dads, a tall guy with sunburned shoulders, pointed at the new sign and said, "This is public now, isn't it? The HOA announced it. They said it was approved." Approved by whom? The tone in his voice was casual but entitled, as though he truly believed it. Another neighbor chimed in, "We even got a text alert from the HOA. They said the old farmhouse property is now part of our common area. They told us to enjoy it before the weather cools." I told them flat out it wasn't true, and I insisted they leave. They exchanged doubtful looks, shrugged, and started packing up, but I could see the confusion on their faces. The HOA had apparently spun some narrative that they had a right to do this. One family left quietly, but the other argued for a minute, insisting I was mistaken. I maintained my calm tone, reminded them of my posted no trespassing signs near my driveway, and eventually they wandered off, mumbling complaints. Right after they left, I yanked that fraudulent sign out of my ground, carried it back to my porch, and decided that my next step had to be a serious one. I needed documentation of this nonsense. I grabbed my phone, took photos and videos of where the sign had been placed, the property boundaries, and the no trespassing signs that had been there long before. I also recorded a short video of myself explaining what happened, just in case I needed a personal record of that day's events. That night, I did some research. My property deed was on file at the county courthouse. Absolutely no HOA claim there. I knew my boundaries were properly surveyed. The HOA had no jurisdiction over my place. They couldn't just declare something to be public. Yet they'd done exactly that and convinced at least a few neighbors it was legal. This wasn't just annoying. It was dangerous. What if someone got hurt on my land? I had liability concerns. If someone drowned in my pond, would they sue me or the HOA? It was a nightmare waiting to happen. The next morning, I decided I needed to face the HOA directly. I found Curtis's contact information from one of the newsletters. I'd kept a few just in case, and called him. He picked up on the second ring, sounding almost cheerful. "Hey there, I was wondering when I'd hear from you," he said, as though this was all some game. I cut straight to the point. "Curtis, remove that sign you installed on my property and send a correction to all those neighbors you misinformed. My land is private. You have no right to declare it otherwise." He chuckled, actually chuckled. Then he started rattling off some nonsense about a covenant that the original developer of the area signed decades ago, supposedly granting certain recreational easements. He claimed that my pond was once part of a larger waterway system that had been used for community events in the past. I knew he was bluffing. I had thoroughly checked the property records before I bought this place. There was no such easement. None of this was in my deed or the county records. I told him I knew better, and I advised him to correct the situation before I had to take it further. Curtis sighed and said, "We're not trying to cause trouble. We're just trying to incorporate everyone into the community. Don't you realize how isolated you've been? We believe the neighborhood deserves a common area to foster togetherness." He spoke with a tone that bordered on condescending. I realized this wasn't about some legal detail. It was about power and control. The HOA had decided I needed to be brought into line, and they were going to do it by force. I hung up and immediately made calls to a lawyer I knew, a family friend named Marlena who specialized in property law. Marlena listened carefully, asked for scans of my deed, any correspondence, and photos of the sign. She told me flat out this was illegal. "They cannot just declare private property to be public," she said. "This could be considered trespassing, possibly even fraud if they're making false statements about ownership." Marlena recommended I send a strongly worded letter demanding immediate removal of all claims to my property and threatening legal action if they persisted. She even offered to draft it for me. I agreed, and within a day I had a letter ready. It was firm, professional, and cited the relevant property laws. I mailed it to the HOA's official address and to each board member's home address, just to be safe. In the meantime, I put up additional signage, large, clear signs at all entry points to my property, stating that it was private land, no unauthorized entry allowed, and that violators would be reported to law enforcement. I also installed a couple of motion-activated cameras facing my driveway and the path leading to the pond. I wanted evidence if anyone tried to test my resolve again. That weekend, I got another surprise. I woke up Saturday morning to find that someone had placed a second sign at the edge of my property line, this time even bigger, with bold letters that read, "Community swimming hole open to residents with HOA membership." My blood pressure soared. They were doubling down, ignoring my letter entirely. I took it down immediately, saving it as evidence. Then I marched over to Curtis's house. He lived just a few blocks away in a 2-story home with a manicured lawn. I had never been inside his place, never wanted to, but I knew where it was. I knocked on his door. His spouse answered, looking startled to see me. I said politely, "I need to speak to Curtis." The spouse called him, and he appeared, dressed in casual clothes, coffee mug in hand. I held up the new sign and said, "Curtis, what are you doing? I've sent a legal notice. Are you trying to invite a lawsuit?" He smiled thinly and claimed ignorance. "I didn't put that up," he said. Perhaps one of the residents took the initial announcement too far. He tried to play innocent, but I could see a gleam of satisfaction behind his eyes. "I can't control what the neighbors do," he said, shrugging. "If they believe the land is public, maybe it's because you haven't made it clear enough that it's not." He had turned my own words against me, as if I were at fault. I reminded him, voice steady, that I had made it abundantly clear and had legal documents to back it up. Curtis tried a different tactic. "Would you consider some kind of compromise? Maybe you could lease the pond area to the HOA for a modest fee, and in return, we'd handle maintenance. It might be easier for everyone." I almost laughed. They wanted me to hand over control of my land through some rigged deal. This was extortion disguised as a friendly solution. I refused and left, reminding him that legal action was imminent if this didn't stop. Over the next week, I noticed an uptick in foot traffic near my boundaries. People walking dogs along my fence line, curious kids poking around, couples strolling near my orchard as if window shopping. The cameras recorded a few instances of people coming closer to my pond, but then turning back when they saw the new signs. I got several irritated knocks on my door from neighbors who asked things like, "The HOA said this is a community resource now. Why are you blocking us?" Or, "We pay high HOA fees. We should be able to use the pond." It was clear Curtis was spreading misinformation. I explained to each visitor that they had been misled and that I had legal documents proving the property was mine alone. Some were understanding and left with embarrassed apologies. Others stormed off, saying they would talk to the HOA. I always remained calm, but inside I was growing angrier by the day. This was harassment, and it was being orchestrated by people who should have known better. A few days later, I got a call from Marlena. She had sent the legal demand letter, and the HOA's lawyer responded with a bizarre letter of their own. Their lawyer claimed they had an old community charter referencing a public amenity on the land that now formed part of my farm. Marlena asked the HOA's lawyer for a copy of this alleged charter. Their lawyer said it was in the archives, and they'd produce it shortly. Marlena warned me this could be a stalling tactic. She suggested we escalate and file a lawsuit if they didn't back down soon. I decided to gather more evidence. I headed to the county records office and spent hours combing through old deeds, charters, maps, and survey results. I knew my property's history. It was once part of a larger estate owned by a family that never joined any HOA. Later, the land was subdivided, and I bought a big chunk of it, including the orchard and the pond. There was no record of any community easement. None. I made copies of everything showing my unencumbered title and no sign of any legal right-of-way for neighbors. That evening, a strange thing happened. One of my neighbors, a woman named Leanne, stopped by. Leanne was known around the neighborhood as level-headed and fair. She had served on the HOA board years ago, but stepped down due to disagreements with Curtis and his circle. She said, "I think you should know what's really going on." Apparently, Curtis had cooked up this idea in a closed-door meeting with a few loyalists. Their logic was that forcing my hand could lead me to either sell or give them a portion of land rights. The rumor was they wanted to develop a small community clubhouse or park and needed access to water to make the project more appealing. Since my pond was the only natural water feature near the neighborhood, they decided to just claim it. They didn't anticipate how stubborn I would be or that I would have solid proof of ownership. They had hoped I'd cave under community pressure. This revelation gave me a mix of outrage and determination. They were trying to bully me into giving them my property. I thanked Leanne for her honesty. She encouraged me to stand firm. Not everyone in the HOA is behind this, you know. Many of us think it's ridiculous. I decided I needed to add a layer of deterrence. I knew I couldn't set booby traps or anything dangerous. That would be illegal, but I could make it uncomfortable for trespassers. I consulted Marlena about what was allowed. She said that as long as I posted warnings, I could do non-harmful measures, like putting up a fence or even installing sprinklers that activate near the pond. I decided to fence off the pond area with a proper locked gate. Since the pond was near the back of my property, the fence wouldn't be visible from the main road, but it would be a clear barrier. I put up a tall chain-link fence topped with a sign that read, "Private property, no entry without permission." Inside the fence, I installed a timed sprinkler system that I could activate remotely. Anyone climbing that fence would get drenched and recorded by my cameras. While I worked on the fence, I thought about more direct action. Marlena and I drafted a formal complaint to file with the local authorities for trespassing. She said I should wait until I had a clear incident of forced entry. Sure enough, the opportunity came sooner than expected. A few days after the fence went up, my cameras caught two teens from the neighborhood climbing over. They hopped right over the chain-link barrier to go for a dip in the pond. I immediately triggered the sprinklers, startling them. They scrambled out, leaving a discarded towel behind. Armed with the footage, I reported the incident to the local police. I didn't want to press charges against teenagers right away, but I wanted an official record. The responding officer was sympathetic and understanding, taking my statement and watching the footage. He said he'd talk to the teens' parents. I asked him if he'd also make it clear to the HOA that they have no right to encourage this kind of behavior. The officer nodded, saying he'd pass along the message. The next day, I received a letter from the HOA's so-called lawyer. It accused me of harassing community members and creating hazardous conditions. They claimed I was using extreme measures against residents who believed in good faith. They had a right to the property. I forwarded this letter to Marlena. She almost laughed at its emptiness. Then she filed a more formal letter threatening to take the HOA to court for harassment, defamation, and intentional trespass. She also requested a formal injunction to prevent them from making any more claims about my land. The HOA's bravado began to crack. Within a week of Marlena's letter, I noticed fewer people skulking around. I got a call from one of the other board members, a man named Todd, who tried a softer approach. He insisted that the HOA had acted on misunderstood historical records and that they wanted to reach a friendly resolution. I told him that the only friendly resolution I'd accept was a public retraction, a letter to all HOA members stating that my land was private and always had been, and a guarantee that they would never try this again. He said he'd bring it to the board. A few days later, the HOA sent a neighborhood-wide email. I received a copy in my inbox because I had asked Marlena to put me on their distribution list for updates. It read, in part, after careful review of historical property records, it appears that the farmland near the pond is indeed private property, belonging solely to the owner. The HOA apologizes for any confusion. Please respect private property rights. It was a bland, face-saving statement, but it was something. I thought it might be over after that. But Curtis had one last card to play. About a week later, he knocked on my door in the early evening. I considered not answering, but I wanted to see what he had to say. He looked tired and less cocky than before. He offered what he called a win-win. He said, "What if we pay you to let us host a summer festival by the pond each year? We'll pay a fee, and we won't claim any permanent rights." I stared at him, appalled that he still didn't get it. I asked if he realized how much turmoil he'd caused, how he'd slandered me to the community, and how he'd potentially put me at risk of legal trouble by tricking neighbors into trespassing. Curtis tried to deflect. "Everyone was confused," he said. "We can move forward. Let's be reasonable." I told him that I would never let the HOA use my land for anything. I made it clear I intended to keep the fence up and would report any future trespassing. He left, grumbling that I was being unneighborly. After that, I decided to tie things up neatly. Marlena and I filed a formal complaint against the HOA with the state's Consumer Affairs Division and the county's Property Rights Board, attaching all the evidence, the fraudulent signs, the letters, the recorded incidents of trespassing, and the false statements. We asked that the HOA be reprimanded or fined for their actions. It took about a month, but eventually the county's Property Rights Board sent the HOA a notice of violation. They were fined a modest amount, nothing huge, but enough to sting. More importantly, it was a matter of public record now that the HOA had overstepped. The HOA board had to eat that cost, and I heard through the grapevine that many members were furious with Curtis and his allies, seeing this as a waste of HOA funds. It sparked a petition among residents to hold a special meeting to consider removing Curtis from the board. Leanne stopped by again after this and told me that the residents were appalled at how the HOA had tried to misappropriate my property. Many demanded changes to the bylaws to prevent something like this from happening again. Curtis, cornered and unpopular, ended up resigning from his position 2 months later. I watched from the sidelines, not particularly rejoicing, but feeling relieved that justice had played out. A new board took over, led by more moderate voices like Todd and a couple of other neighbors who, while still part of the HOA structure, at least understood private property laws and boundaries. In the aftermath, the neighborhood dynamic shifted. The hostile glances stopped. The random visitors ceased. My cameras recorded no more trespassers. A few neighbors even brought over small gifts, some homemade cookies, a bottle of local honey, to apologize for the trouble. I accepted these gestures politely, trying to move on from the ordeal. I made it clear that I wasn't holding grudges, but that I would remain protective of my land. Meanwhile, the orchard and the pond thrived. I expanded my vegetable plot and started planting a few new fruit trees near the back fence line. I even set up a picnic table for myself, a private spot where I could sit and watch ducks dabble in the water. This was my haven after all, and I wanted to enjoy it in peace. Marlena and I also took the opportunity to update my signage. We placed a proper legal plaque stating that the property was recorded as private land in the county registry and that any claims otherwise were null and void. It felt a bit like overkill, but after what I'd been through, I valued that extra layer of deterrence. A subtle but satisfying coda to the story came months later when the new HOA board sent out a newsletter about future community improvements. This time, they highlighted projects in spaces the HOA truly owned. like a small park near the entrance of the neighborhood. They described plans for a neat gazebo and some flower beds. Not once did they mention my property or try to spin any stories about easements. In fact, they used the newsletter to remind residents to respect private property owners in the area. Clearly, the lesson had been learned. On a personal level, I found a sense of accomplishment in standing my ground. I had been tested by a group that thought they could rewrite the rules to suit their own agenda by responding steadily and legally. By documenting everything, by seeking professional advice, I had shown them I wouldn't be an easy target. I discovered that property owners' rights are well protected by law if you know how to assert them. The HOA's attempt to transform my pond into a public swimming hole had failed spectacularly. I also learned that not everyone in an HOA community is out to get you. People like Leanne proved that allies can emerge from unexpected places, and some neighbors, once they realized the truth, were genuinely sorry for the confusion. This taught me an important lesson. Behind the organizational misconduct were everyday folks who had been misled. Once corrected, most were willing to respect the truth. Over time, I got more involved in local civic groups that help property owners understand their rights. I shared my experience at a local gathering of farmers and large lot homeowners. Many found it incredible that an HOA would try such a brazen move. One older farmer, Harold, shook his head and said, "They picked the wrong person to mess with." We all had a good chuckle over that. In the end, no one can just declare your land public property. The rule of law still stands. If someone tries, you can and should fight back. I proved that. My pond remains peaceful, my orchard thrives, and the misguided scheme of a power-hungry HOA president is just a strange chapter in the neighborhood's history now. People still whisper about it occasionally, shaking their heads at the audacity, but no one tries to dispute my boundaries anymore. If I ever again find a random sign on my property claiming it belongs to someone else, I know exactly what to do. Document, seek legal counsel, and stand firm. It's not pleasant to be forced into a conflict like this, but sometimes you have to guard what's yours. I did, and I'm proud of the outcome. The HOA learned that their authority doesn't extend beyond their actual legally defined domain. I think that's a lesson that will stick with them for a long time. My land, my pond, my orchard, these are mine. I didn't give them up and I never will. Friends, thank you. See you soon.